This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You
Exactly.
say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And we deliver what we say we're going to deliver.
My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I try to provide context and background to a big story in the news. Today, as Scotland gears up to vote for a new parliament, is it also heading for another independence referendum? Just 7 years after what some said should have been a once-in-a-generation event, will the existence of the UK be soon on the line if Scots are asked again to say yes or no to independence? I'm joined by Mandy Rhodes, managing editor of Holyrood Magazine and long-term observer of Scotland's political scene. Is this election about independence?
Well, for the last 14 years with the SNP in power, it's always been about independence. I don't think that should surprise anybody. That's their raison d'etre.
But it's not about education, it's not about how they've handled the COVID pandemic, it's not about what's been happening in the health service.
I think, to be honest, if it was about any of those things, then perhaps Nicola Sturgeon wouldn't be the only person standing to be First Minister at the moment. And that is what's happening. It's a bizarre situation. I mean, the title of your podcast, is exactly what we're all saying at the moment. How did we get here? And there is only one person in this election vying to be the next First Minister. It's an extraordinary state of affairs.
I mean, there is realistically no chance that she won't end up as First Minister after May the 6th.
No one else is even pretending that they're standing for that position, Andy. I mean, they're all, at the moment, the other parties are basically vying to be the opposition. And that's a strange ambition to have.
So, but I come back to my point again, I suppose, which obviously independence is a big issue. Shouldn't she also be in a situation where she is having to defend what the SNP has done in government since 2007? I mean, it doesn't seem to be even talked about in a significant way.
Yes, of course it should. It should. I mean, I guess my point would be that I don't think it's a particularly healthy sign of our politics that we have almost what feels like a one-party state. And, when you've got the Labour Party in Scotland, I mean, the Labour Party, Andy, they used to rule Scotland at all levels. The Labour Party is going into this election saying that we should have a credible opposition, despite the fact that they've been in opposition since 2007. And the reason that the domestic record is not particularly being examined, although people are trying, is that there is no opposition.
Just remind us then, on independence, where does everybody stack up obviously, SNP, Scottish National Party, in favour of independence. Where is everybody else when it comes to that major issue?
So basically you've got the SNP and the Greens and now ALBA, which is led by Alex Salmond, there's some other fringe parties, but basically that's the pro-independence bloc. And then you've got the Scottish Conservatives, Scottish Labour and the Liberal Democrats as the unionist side, if you like. And then within that, you've got different views within that unionist side about whether there should even be a second independence referendum. And that's perhaps where Labour has lost support over the years.
Because the Labour position became a bit more nuanced, didn't it?
It did. I mean, so there's a view by some that in Labour that you should allow a referendum to happen if that's what people want. I guess there's a question mark about, well, how do you decide that people want that? Is that by voting in the SNP again or not? And there are others within the Labour Party, including the new leader, Anna Sarwar, who feel that this is not the time and that there shouldn't be one.
I mean, that presumably, any time you have any kind of ambivalence or nuance or it's not completely clear, especially at election time, that's normally not a great position for a party to be in that's trying to win votes. Would you say that's the situation for Labour this time?
I think that probably is. I mean, I'm hesitating because it depends what you take from the result of this election. So if we're going into an election all accepting that the SNP are going to win it and that Nicola Sturgeon's going to be the First Minister, it's then going to be a question of by how much she wins it and what that result tells us about anything and whether or not people do want a referendum right now. She says she won't work with Alex Salmond, her previous mentor, leader, and yet he is pro-independence. So again, it'll depend on the size of that pro-independence bloc and whether or not she'll work with someone that she used to work with.
Well, let's talk about Alex Salmond and his move, because that was certainly one of the most jaw-dropping moments recently when he launched his own party, Alba.
Not for us.
Okay, well, why not for you?
Well, because I think in Scotland, Scotland is a small place, and I think never before have I felt it so small as we have in the last, year, 6 months. I think everybody believed that Alex Salmond wouldn't just go away once he was found not guilty in the courts. And there was a lot of speculation here that he would set up his own party. And that's what he's done. Okay,
sure enough, he has done. I mean, he obviously maintains, look, this is all going to be great for the independence cause. I'm not going to cause the SNP any trouble. I'm not going to take votes away from them. Is he right?
Well, his party's only standing on the list. And this is where it gets complicated, I guess, because the Scottish Parliament has a degree of almost proportional representation with this list vote. So his party isn't standing on the list. If the SNP win, say they won all the constituency seats, the arithmetic would not allow them to pick up any of the list seats. So on a very simplistic level, I guess he's right, that if you want a pro-independence bloc, you then vote for the Alba party on the list. But there's also the Greens. And the arithmetic isn't quite that, like everything in Scottish politics, it's not that clear either. But I think the other thing that he has done by coming into this is he's holding a mirror up to the fact that actually the SNP, despite being in power for 14 years, despite Nicola being the First Minister for 7 of those years, she hasn't really moved the dial on independence in terms of support. It's not really gone up. And there's an impatience within some parts of the party about whether political currency around that has been wasted. And what would happen next? Is she too cosy in government? Does she just like being an administrator, a manager? And is she taking the country any closer to independence? So I guess Alba sort of holds a mirror to that.
And does it provide a place where people who are very frustrated with the leadership of Nicola Sturgeon over independence can go, and I guess in theory can reinforce the case if they can win some seats, as you say, on the list part of the Scottish Parliament, the proportional part rather than the first past the post constituencies?
Yeah, I guess on paper, both those things, So again, in Scotland, there have been a couple of fault lines around things like the reform of the Gender Recognition Act. A number of very prominent women, mainly middle-aged women, who had a particular view around self-identification with the gender reform legislation, have moved over to Alba. And because they were beginning to believe they were politically homeless, and that was a feeling long before this party ever launched.
But I guess you talk about holding a mirror up. The very fact that Alex Salmond is there reminds everybody that there has been this massive row inside the Scottish National Party family, for want of a better word.
I think row would be, for want of a better word, as well.
Well. Take it on from there. How bad is it, and has it done real damage to the cause?
It's so hard to tell. I mean, there are such different... I think people with... Nicola Sturgeon probably would want to characterise Alex Salmond's party as a bunch of elderly, disgruntled white men who are a bit fed up with everything. I don't think that's a fair categorisation. And there are others that would like to see would like to characterise the SNP right now as being a bit about virtue signalling, if you like, around some policies. There's a bit of truth in both those things, but they're all connected by a desire for independence.
Does what's happened over the last few months with the all right, you don't like row, civil war, I don't know what, inside the SNP, with the trial of Alex Salmond, of course he was acquitted, and now the new party. I guess what I'm trying to say, is that going to make it less likely that there will be the kind of thumping pro-independence majority that presumably Nicola Sturgeon would want?
Well, the problem is that ALPA is pro-independence. All the polls so far would indicate that what has happened over the last few months has not actually damaged the support of the SNP. I mean, we're still looking at a party that are polling at around 46% of the constituency votes. It's ridiculous. I think undoubtedly, and maybe it's not showing up yet in the polls, there has been damage done to the political institutions of Scotland by the whole, if I can call it loosely, the Salmond affair, if you like. I think all three inquiries that have gone on post him being acquitted have shown real flaws and given a number of people, including myself, a number of concerns about why is no one to blame for some of the things that we've seen go wrong. And it does feel a little unhealthy that you can be worried about criticising the party of government because we are a small country. There are consequences to criticising parties of government that are incredibly strong. And I guess as a political journalist, I do just find it unhealthy that we go into an election with a foregone conclusion. I mean, I'm saying there's a foregone conclusion, but if we come out of that election with the SNP not winning as well as they did in 2016, I think Nicola Sturgeon has a problem, and we may see changes happen then.
A problem in terms of hanging on to her own leadership?
Yeah. I don't know. This must have been the most hellish year possible for a leader to be running a country, going through a pandemic. There's no doubt the pressure on her will have been immense. And as everybody keeps repeating, she's an incredibly good communicator. And I guess there's a point on a personal level where you start to think, if people keep saying I'm just a great communicator, does that mean I'm just about spin? And it comes back to your original question about the domestic record. We've also had some pretty awful assessments of things like record numbers of drug deaths in Scotland, which is just an absolute national shame. And while Nicola at the moment is saying things like, I accept this, it's terrible. Well, the party's been in power for 14 years. At some point you have to take responsibility for these things.
I want to go back to something you mentioned about Nicola Sturgeon and independence, where you said some people might think she's just got a bit too comfortable in government. And I've certainly, all these impressions are superficial, and I admit that, and unscientific. But I've got a sense from a couple of people I've spoken to here that people quite like her running the government and feel she's done a good job through the pandemic. And a couple of them said, I just wish she'd stop going on about independence. And I just wonder if that's the kind of view from some people of her. Do you think it's, is there a sense that, she'd quite like to run the government but doesn't necessarily want to take this enormous risk of having a referendum?
Well, I think there are people within her own party, or those that have now split off and gone to ALPA, for instance, people like Jim Sillars, who falls completely into the categorisation of the kind of elderly white man that's a bit fed up with it all. But he'd been saying for years that he felt that Nicola Sturgeon's government was more about administration and managing than taking something forward. And quite clearly, for a party of independence, there's a very good argument to be saying, here we are in an absolute crisis. This is the moment where you start to talk about how you rebuild and refresh and recover and create a better country. But we're still to hear those arguments. Okay,
well, let's assume that we are going to end up after May the 6th with a majority in the Scottish Parliament for independence, theoretically. What has Nicola Sturgeon said about timings of having that referendum?
Well, she said that she believes that a referendum should be held within the first half of that next 5-year term.
And what about the case now for independence? I mean, there was obviously a referendum in 2014. There was a case to be made then. Do you think, is the perception that the case is stronger now for independence, maybe because of what's happened in the last year in the way that Scotland has run its own affairs when it comes to the pandemic in lots of ways, or just because of the progression of the way that Scotland and London have diverged? Do you think there is a stronger case for independence? Put it this way, not your personal view, but in terms of selling it politically now than there was in 2014?
I think there could be if you made it. There's one argument, which would obviously be the unionist argument right now, which is we're better together to come through a crisis. And certainly things like the vaccination programme have been probably a high point in an incredibly low point in all of our worlds in the last year. The argument for independence should be being made with fervour and joy in the way I guess it was being made back in 2012-13 in the run-up to 2014. For me, right now, there's a lack of joy. There's a lack of positivity. And for a party that is about to win an election, they're very defensive, scratchy, tired, a bit annoyed when you start asking about the domestic record, when you start saying to them, what are you doing about the drug deaths, what are you doing about education? I mean, I look back to ahead of the referendum in 2014, and Nicola Sturgeon was obviously the Deputy First Minister at that point. She asked us all to imagine a baby, Kirsty, born into this new independent Scotland. It was a really evocative thing for me. I can remember thinking about this new baby and all the possibilities. So what I did as the editor of the magazine was, when they lost that referendum, but we went into 2016 and the 2016 election, and Nicola was again asking us to think about the best place for a child to grow up in, and that again felt quite evocative. So I used that baby, Kirsty. We created the Holyrood baby and used as a barometer of how well the politicians were doing in terms of creating this best country for baby Kirsty. And on lots of levels it hasn't come through, and we're going into the 2021 election again being asked by Nicola Sturgeon to imagine Scotland as the best country for a child to grow up in. The message has just been on replay. They need to start painting that positive picture.
Well, what about one huge aspect of making that case, the economic case for an independent Scotland? It was quite a difficult case to make in 2014. I mean, obviously plenty of people would say it wasn't, but on the face of it, quite a difficult case to make. It would seem since then, the oil revenues are just almost not a factor. And also, can you really base in this day and age an economic case on, petroleum and pumping hydrocarbons? Probably not. What is the basis for the economic case for independence right now? Is it being made?
Well, I'm not an economist or the independent strategist, but what I would say to you is I think a lot of people felt 2014 was lost on the economic argument, and it'd be interesting to know where the work has been. I mean, obviously there was a report put out. Nicola Sturgeon's now told us that that's outdated anyway. I don't understand really why there wasn't always parallel work going on about what would this look like in an independent Scotland. Where is the economic argument? And so you're right, the economic argument, as far as I can see, is not being worked on. However, I would also say that we're all at the very rock bottom right now. The UK is in a terrible situation as well, financially and economically. So I would have thought this was a good time to come along and present an argument for how you rebuild better.
And have you not seen that from the SNP at this stage?
No.
So what are they basing the case on for saying now is the time to go for independence?
Well, the problem is that if you ask people why they wanted independence now, or if the way the party is promoting it, it's Boris Johnson. And, for most of us that have been around for a long time, we know that Prime Ministers change. The First Ministers might not, but Prime Ministers do.
Is Boris Johnson kind of the dream Prime Minister as far as the SNP is concerned?
Yes.
Well, it looks like he should be around for a while, which leads me on to the next point, of course, which is he has said he will not allow a referendum in the way that David Cameron did sign off a referendum in 2014. And that remains the prerogative of the UK government in this situation. Is there any discussion of what happens, presuming that A, there is a referendum asked for in Scotland, and then B, Boris Johnson says, no, you're not having it?
Well, I guess this takes us back to the Nicola Sturgeon-Alex Salmond dynamic as well, doesn't it? So people that had become impatient about a referendum not happening when you had a majority and then you had a majority SNP and then you had a pro-independence majority of the SNP and Greens would say that Nicola Sturgeon's too cautious and hasn't taken it forward. And you've got Alex Salmond coming along at this point with his party saying, well, you know, David Cameron said he wouldn't give us a referendum and I persuaded him and he did it. And Alex Salmond saying very clearly that if they get seats in the Holyrood election, they will immediately put pressure on the Scottish government to ask the UK government to start proceedings towards a referendum. So he's looking like this radical, I guess, and she's looking less so.
Has she at all suggested ever the idea of a Catalan referendum? In other words, you just do it even if the UK government doesn't want it?
Well, I mean, I have to say all of them, including Alex Salmond, previously in his previous guise, would have said no to an illegal referendum, that it was all about being credible, being legal, taking this forward, we're all going to work together afterwards if Scotland did become independent. I don't think it's in her psyche to think we would do something like that. At the moment, you're not hearing that from anybody. I think there's always this belief, and I suppose it was a bit like the belief during the independence referendum that you would eventually just get an agreement to a shared currency, even though, you know, the Prime Minister at that point was saying that would never happen. There's just this belief that the UK government will eventually just say, yes, here's your referendum.
And they can try and take it all the way to the Supreme Court, I guess, but
Yeah.
And just that would be part of building the pressure. But I mean, we don't know how the Supreme Court would rule. But on the face of it, it would remain the case that the UK government would have to sign off a referendum of that kind, I imagine. So, I mean, are we set? Do you feel like we're heading for a sort of standoff that could dominate kind of UK politics, you know, for a while after this election in May? Because, you know, if the basic facts are all in place as we've set them out, you know, a majority for the SNP or a pro-independence majority, request for a referendum denied, are we just stuck with that then? Is that something we're going to be living with? I
mean, you know, I've lived in Scotland most of my life. It might surprise you to know that I was actually born in Newcastle and lived there until I was 10. This has dominated my life forever, the constitutional question. I don't see it going away anytime soon. I mean, I think the question also is to be asked is why do you think the UK government wants to refuse the Section 30 order for Scotland to hold that referendum? And that's because we sit on a knife edge either way. It's still sitting at that kind of 50-50, give or take a bit. You know, just as a feeling, I mean, you mentioned earlier that none of this is very scientific. This doesn't feel like it felt back in 2012-13.
I mean, you mentioned that you didn't feel there was any joy about the prospect. Is that what you mean here?
Yeah, lack of positivity. That's absolutely, and you know, that was quite a contrived thing at the time. You know, that was very much about Salmond and presumably Sturgeon as his deputy and the whole team saying, this is about our team, our record, our vision. This is about creating something much more exciting. There was a real momentum. There isn't a momentum at the moment, I don't feel. It doesn't feel like that.
Nevertheless, we're expecting a pro-independence majority. I mean, is a simple majority enough? Or would there be a feeling that you really should have done better? If you want a referendum, you've got to almost sweep the board.
Yeah, I think the worst case scenario for Nicola will be that she doesn't do as well as 2016 when they lost. The Parliament was never designed to have a majority, so that was unprecedented clearly when it happened in 2011. 2016 they were, I think, 2 short of a majority or 1, and the Greens helped make that up in terms of pro-independence. I think if the SNP doesn't do as well as a party as it did in 2016, her position becomes quite difficult on the back of everything else as well. If the majority is made up with Alex Salmond sitting in the Parliament, that will also be very uncomfortable for her. I mean, I think there's a lot of us feel that perhaps a time in opposition might be a good way to refresh.
The SNP?
Yeah.
That's not going to happen though, is it?
No, it's not.
No. I mean, just a quick thought. Who do you think will emerge as the opposition after this election?
Oh, God, it's so difficult. I think Anna Sarwar is doing a good job as the new leader of Labour, but it's so early or so late in the day, if you like, in the run-up to the election. Labour would be interesting. Douglas Ross obviously is still an MP and he's leading the Scottish Conservative Party. I'm not sure he's got the tone right at the moment for this election. I suspect it'll be Labour. Okay,
but in the end, as we say, they are campaigning to be the opposition because of where we are. Just a final thought. I've met a couple of people who say, I'm just worn out. I'm just exhausted by this whole question of of independence, of the constitutional settlement. I mean, is that a little how you feel right now? No,
no, God, no. I mean, I love the debate. I love, I guess I said to someone recently, because it is very hard when the party's been in opposition for a long time, which the SNP had been. You got to know people very, very well. And I can remember, 2004, 2003, starting to write columns that were much more critical of Labour as leaders, as being in power. And you were seen as being a traitor, as a journalist, because they were mistaking you for a friend. And Scotland is small, Andy, so it's painful. So that bit is bruising. I'm criticising people that I've got very close to, but just on a theoretical level, I find this unhealthy at the moment. And I would like to see, I'm not tired, but I would like to see a bit more, I keep saying it, I sound like positivity. I think that's what I want to see, a bit more excitement, a bit more positivity. I know we've all had a hellish time in this last year, but we need to come through it being different. I mean, Nicola, at the end of this Parliament, the very last session, she talked about, and it had clearly been personally really difficult for her, all these issues around Alex Salmond, the various inquiries, some which vindicated her, others that really revealed the flaws in her government. And she said that it felt like a toxic environment. I think she also has to recognise her role in that toxic environment, and that the election isn't just about breathing fresh air on the opposition, it's about her government and her party too.
So she might have to, after this election, take things in a new direction, and on the face of it, that sounds like push for that referendum.
Well, that's certainly what her party would want. I don't know. I mean, I think we could be having this discussion in 2025, and I'm saying to you, I think maybe the Labour Party will be back in power. I don't know. I mean, it'd be a fool to predict what's happening in Scotland apart from, I can tell you, on May the 7th, Nicola Sturgeon will be back in Bute House and the SNP will still be in power. Would I quite like to see more of a rainbow-type coalition going on? Possibly, because it'd be more interesting.
Would you like to see a referendum happening on the grounds that at least that might be a breakthrough from out of the situation that we're in at the moment, one way or the other? I don't think it would lance the boil. I think it will just continue. So, if we have a referendum and it's yes,
for independence. It would be about the margins within that. I mean, you know, no only marginally won last time. You'd have to decide where you think this was an overriding, overwhelming result. I can't imagine being a Scot, living in Scotland and not having a constitutional argument always going on. It's kind of what we are. Sorry.
Well, Mandy Rhodes, thanks very much indeed for talking to us for this edition of How Did We Get Here. I think, as you say, we're going to be talking more about this, but I get the feeling this is going to be one of those facts of UK political life for some time.
It's more like, how will we get there?
That's the next series.
Yeah. All right, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed. Mandy Rhodes with her view on Scotland's choice that could become Britain's drama. If you have thoughts on this or ideas for another podcast, please email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting at AndyBell5News. And please share, rate and review. Thanks for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.